The name of this section is American Responses because we're going to be discussing what was happening in America in response to the British invasion. So let's review some of the most important story points so far. We have the first wave of rock and roll. Some of the best artists were Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Buddy Holly. In 1959, all of these most important artists stopped performing music for various reasons. Additionally, because of these payola scandals, the major labels, through Congress, made it so that the indie labels weren't able to produce rock and roll anymore, so the major labels essentially took over rock music. That's when we get to this period from 1960 to 1963, known as either the Golden Age or the Dark Ages of rock, and it was all about trying to find this next Elvis. That's when we got the teen idols and surf music and the folk revival started. Then, in 1964, the Beatles arrived in America and started the British invasion. The Beatles were the biggest band we'd ever seen, and all these British acts come to America and find success. One of the reasons that Elvis was considered so successful is he was the first major artist to have multiple songs at #1 on the mainstream pop, rhythm and blues, and country and western charts. And that's still very impressive, but the Beatles had the top 5 songs simultaneously on the charts. So the Beatles were the group that emerged as the next Elvis, the next mega group of the world. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other groups with the British invasion may have knocked America out of the #1 spot for pop music in the mid-1960s, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't great music being produced in America. Over the next few lectures, we're going to talk about some of those great American musical artists of the mid-1960s. The first person we're going to talk about is Bob Dylan. Now, Bob Dylan is important because he establishes a new model, being a singer and songwriter in popular music. Like the Beatles, Bob Dylan also displaces this brill-building approach. However, Bob Dylan is similar to what the Beatles are doing, and they're usually combined together. That the Beatles had the self-contained band, but that led to focusing on authenticity, whereas Bob Dylan has the singer-songwriter model, also focusing on authenticity. By singer-songwriter, we just mean that generally when you go to hear this music or see it performed or listen to it on a record, you're expecting that there's probably going to be one person, one man or woman, standing there, probably playing a guitar or some other instrument, singing, and maybe they have a harmonica or something, but it's just one person producing all of the music, and they're the person who wrote the songs. Bob Dylan's first hits come in 1965 after the British invasion, but he actually had albums before that. He just got a slow start. His first albums were what we consider underground folk music. So Bob Dylan was a folk artist, but initially he didn't have any mainstream success. He was born Robert Allen Zimmerman to a Jewish family in Duluth, Minnesota. He took the nickname Bob and used the stage last name Dylan in reference to one of his favorite poets, Dylan Thomas. And that's significant that Bob Dylan, who's known as this great American songwriter, is really inspired by poetry because really that's Bob Dylan's greatest strength. He actually will go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature for his poetic lyrics. In 1959, Bob Dylan attended the University of Minnesota, and he grew up with this first wave of rock and roll. So those were his favorite artists when he was a teenager. But like so many other people who were teenagers during the first wave of rock and roll, he becomes interested in folk as he gets to college. After some minor success as a musician in Duluth, he moves to New York City. And he actually befriends Woody Guthrie. If you remember, Woody Guthrie was the folk artist from the 1940s, around World War II, who had This Machine Kills Fascists on his guitar, and he wrote This Land Is Your Land. Well, at this point, Woody Guthrie is dying of Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is an inherited disease that causes the progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain, has a broad impact on a person's functional abilities, and usually results in movement thinking and psychiatric disorders. What Bob Dylan does is he begins regularly visiting Woody Guthrie in the hospital. Woody Guthrie is his hero. He grew up listening to his music, and he's a huge fan. And actually, not very many people come to visit Woody Guthrie in this last stage of his life. So he and Bob Dylan actually become close friends despite the decades difference in their age. And during this time, Woody Guthrie really teaches Bob Dylan about folk music and about being a songwriter and about being a musician and a performer. Many music scholars have said that Woody Guthrie passed the mantle to Bob Dylan at this time, that he gave him the tools that he would need to be successful in the folk world. Not too long after that, Woody Guthrie passes, but Bob Dylan continues to work with and learn from more experienced acts, such as Peter, Paul, and Mary, who we've talked about. Now, Peter, Paul, and Mary would actually make Bob Dylan's song Blowin' in the Wind a hit during the early stages of the folk revival in the early 1960s. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Those of you familiar with Bob Dylan's career might be surprised to hear that in his early stages as a performer, he actually had a lot of humor in his act. It was a lot of comedy interacting with the audience. Now he's known for these earnest performances and lyrics, and if there is any humor, it's very sarcastic and ironic. But it wasn't like that at the time. It was much more lighthearted and fun in 1960. In the fall of 1961, he signed it to Columbia Records by John Hammond. This is years before anyone knows who Bob Dylan is. He is by no means a successful artist. In 1962, Bob Dylan releases a self-titled debut album that flops and only sells about 5,000 copies. Because this album was produced by John Hammond, and it was essentially his responsibility to make sure that this record is a hit, that album's nickname is Hammond's Folly. Bob Dylan then signs with manager, so again, John Hammond was his record producer. Now he's signing with manager Albert Grossman. There's a lot of friction between John Hammond and Albert Grossman. They can't really seem to get along. So eventually what happens is Hammond steps down as producer. And again, Bob Dylan's only had one album and it did terribly. So he's not really thinking this is much of a loss for him. And another producer by the name of Tom Wilson takes over. We'll talk about him more a little bit later. So remember that name, Tom Wilson. At this point, even though he has had one album, Bob Dylan is still known as a songwriter. Again, he wrote the hit song for Peter, Paul, and Mary, which at the time was one of the biggest groups in folk music. Because Blowin' in the Wind was such a big hit, Bob Dylan decides that he's going to record the song, and it's his song, he wrote it, he has the rights to do that. But it was rejected, and the reason was people told him his voice wasn't polished enough. His voice wasn't suitable for radio. He has a very high, kind of nasally sounding voice. Even today, if people try to do a Bob Dylan impression, it's usually a very high nasally sound that they use to sound like him. But despite this, he isn't discouraged. He keeps pushing forward. He releases an album called The Times They Are Changing and one called Another Side of Bob Dylan. Neither of these albums are commercially successful, but both of them, along with his first self-titled album, are gaining traction within the folk community. So he's not getting radio airplay, he's not selling out in record stores, but in Greenwich Village in New York City, he is gaining a following of people that really love his music, specifically because of the lyrics. During this time, Bob Dylan develops as a socially conscious songwriter. So when we think of folk music of the late 1960s that's so focused on social justice, civil rights, being against the war in Vietnam, all of those aspects of folk music, it really starts with Bob Dylan during this time. Additionally, he also begins to develop his own voice as a songwriter. At this point, the folk music tradition was really focused on we, about all of us. What can we do? What can we do for each other? What can we do for the greater good of others? Whereas Bob Dylan starts writing about himself. In the textbook, this is described as going from we to me. It's not about writing about all of us, it's about writing about yourself. And not in any kind of egotistical way, but just in the sense of, how do I feel about something? How am I processing this? Because what Bob Dylan found is that many people felt the way he did, and this was a way for them to connect by acknowledging that everyone goes through certain emotions and certain feelings. We could really say that it's at this point that Bob Dylan's singer-songwriter model comes to fruition. One of his first hits released after this point is called Don't Think Twice, It's Alright. It's about a breakup. After that, he releases another hit song called Mr. Tambourine Man. Now, there was a festival, a music festival called the Newport Folk Festival. It was held every year, and in 1964, because of hits like Don't Think Twice, It's Alright and Mr. Tambourine Man, combined with this folk following he had in New York, Bob Dylan is invited to perform at the 1964 Newport Folk Festival, and it's a big hit. When you watch this performance, you see everything you would expect to see. It's one man with an acoustic guitar, a harmonica strapped on, he's singing and he's playing by himself. So I'm going to conclude this video by showing you a clip of Bob Dylan performing at the 1964 Newport Folk Festival.